Operation Barbarossa commenced on June 22, 1941. Initiating what we know ultimately led to a complete German defeat, despite its early triumphs. When dissecting the causes behind this defeat, various well-known factors invariably surface, all of which we'll delve into on this channel. These include the formidable defense of the Red Army, substantial German casualties, adverse weather conditions, muddy terrain, and, most significantly, the logistical strain endured by the Wehrmacht. Yet, many historians tend to overlook this pivotal aspect of the German setback in the East. Why did the logistics of the Wehrmacht falter precisely? What triggered the collapse of Wehrmacht logistics in early 1942? At what point did the failure of the Barbarossa strategy become apparent? Despite penetrating deep into the European expanse of the Soviet Union, why did German forces become ensnared in the East? Why did Leningrad and Moscow remain beyond capture? The Russian counteroffensive, reclaiming Rostov and other territories, precipitated a wave of resignations at the highest echelons of the Wehrmacht, particularly within the army. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, the army's chief commander, was among those who lost his position. Not only him, many commanders of army groups and army commanders lost their positions. And in January 1942, Hitler summoned Wilhelm Kleinmann and shouted at him and said, "It was all his fault. The fact that our armies are hundreds of kilometers deep into Russia, without winter clothing, without lubricants, without ammunition, without tanks. Kleinmann, it's all your fault. Gestapo should deal with you." Today, when many people learn about the history of wars, they often receive a very narrowed image of the war in many books. War is a phenomenon for which the state is responsible, and the armed forces are merely an emanation of this state on the battlefield. Individuals like Wilhelm Kleinmann, individuals like Julius Dorpmüller, Minister of Transport of the German Reich, in the German state hierarchy, actually held positions equivalent to people like Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Field Marshal Brauchitsch, or Field Marshals like von Kluge or von Manstein. Currently, when we discuss the Second World War, it becomes apparent that figures like Julius Dorpmüller or Wilhelm Kleinmann are completely unknown. Who were these people? Julius Dorpmüller, highly respected and regarded as an expert in the field of transportation during Adolf Hitler's reign in the German Reich, served as the Minister of Transport, while Wilhelm Kleinmann was the State Secretary. These two individuals governed an immensely important institution for the German state and the projection of Wehrmacht's strength. They managed the Deutsche Reichsbahn, the German railway system. It was precisely the inefficiency of the German railways in Operation Barbarossa that largely contributed to the German defeat. 4 reasons can be cited for this. Firstly, the strong resistance of the Red Army. In Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army offered robust resistance. However, the Red Army was actually the weakest link in the Soviet Union, despite fighting fiercely. In 1941, the Red Army suffered a series of staggering defeats on tactical, operational, and even strategic scales. Secondly, the significant losses suffered by the Wehrmacht were crucial. In 1941, the Wehrmacht incurred enormous personnel losses in the East. The weather, especially the sudden autumn weather changes accompanied by mud, and later the severe winter frosts of 1941 also played a significant role. The year 1942 also held significant importance for the German defeat. But these 3 factors were secondary to the last fourth element, namely, the collapse of German logistics. German logistics crumbled due to the inefficiency of the supply system, primarily based on railways. It was the failure of the German railway system that let down the Wehrmacht in Operation Barbarossa, and that's precisely why Hitler yelled at Kleinmann at the beginning of 1942. In May 1942, Wilhelm Kleinmann, an old 60-plus railway specialist, left his position, replaced by a turbo-Nazi, 37-year-old Albert Ganzenmüller, who was relatively young for such a role. Meanwhile, the esteemed Minister of Transport of the Reich, Julius Dorpmüller, remained in his position, but one could say he became a figurehead because the German railway was effectively taken over by individuals like Ganzenmüller and Albert Speer. The very fact that in the collective consciousness, when we talk about any war, especially in the European context in the first half of the 20th century, we often overlook the importance of logistics, the rear areas, how crucial logistics is in determining everything. The Poles learned this during the defense of their country in 1939, how the operational capabilities of the Polish military to deploy forces, mobilize, and conduct campaigns were stifled by the inadequacy of the railway system. World War II appears as a modern armed conflict. At first glance, railways are much more associated with the First World War. Was the railway system sidelined during the Second World War? Was it in the shadows? Did it perhaps play an equally important role in this conflict as it did during the First World War? The relegation of the railway issue during the Second World War to the shadows is entirely mistaken. War is a system. We can compare railways to the circulatory system. The body will not function properly if the circulatory system does not operate correctly. Similarly, armed forces engaged in war will not function efficiently if the railway system does not adequately replenish the needs of the front lines. Furthermore, this system must be efficient enough to increase the potential of their own troops on the front lines. This is precisely what doomed the Germans in 1941. When we look at how Germany built the Wehrmacht in the 1930s, we notice that on the battlefield, it was an army capable of a powerful and extremely violent strike, but only to a depth of no more than 600 kilometers. For such distances, the advancing army is not yet heavily reliant on the railway system. In campaigns against Poland or France, the Wehrmacht could achieve victory even without efficient military railways. However, in June 1941, Hitler launched an attack on a country whose capital lay about 1,000 kilometers from the starting line of his troops. The Soviet Union was a vast country, and even reaching the Volga required covering immense distances. Here, the railway was absolutely essential. How strong was the German railway at the outbreak of the war? In the 1930s, Germany invested in railways because they played a crucial role in their economic and communication systems. However, it's evident that during Hitler's era, these investments were severely restricted. Railways received more modern steam engines. New lines were built. But in the struggle for material and labor allocation, and above all for steel allocations, it lost out to other sectors of the economy. Railways require steel, steam engines, rails, and many components are made of steel. In 1936, 1937, and 1938, it was clear that the old Dorpmüller was clearly losing out to military commanders in the allocation of steel and losing out to exports in steel allocations. Nazi Germany ramped up its armaments to such an extent that the German mark had no value for other countries. Hitler traded resources with the entire world, exchanging goods. One could say that steel was the currency of the Reich, despite being the largest producer of steel in Europe. Germany exported steel. However, in the 1930s, the German railway lost significant steel allocations. It did not develop as it should have according to Hitler's expectations. Hitler was building an army of conquest, but couldn't simultaneously build both an army of conquest and the infrastructure to support it. He developed the Wehrmacht, but did not develop the railway system properly. In the German system, the railway was fundamental. Despite the development of motorization, the German army relied on the railway and stood by it. The railway network of Nazi Germany was extremely dense. In 1938, it amounted to 65,000 kilometers of tracks. For comparison, in Poland, it was 20,000 kilometers of tracks. In the Soviet Union, the largest country in the world, it was just over 100,000 kilometers of tracks. At first glance, these figures do not indicate that the railway was not particularly developed in Germany. However, 65,000 kilometers of tracks were still insufficient for such a colossal army as the Wehrmacht. You can't just move those 65,000 kilometers of tracks elsewhere. Before the war, the Deutsche Reichsbahn had 25,000 locomotives, 80,000 various types of wagons, and 700,000 employees. It was a colossus. It was a giant. 700,000 people worked on the German railway, and they had the largest fleet of locomotives and wagons in the whole of Europe. It was a gigantic force. But it was insufficient compared to Hitler's expectations. If he wanted to conquer only Poland or France, then this power was sufficient. But if one wanted to reach for Russia, one had to multiply their potential many times over. Germany underestimated this issue. They developed their railway troops too slowly, and it later backfired on them. Of course, Germany was aware that the logistics system was crucial. When France fell in June 1940, Hitler summoned his generals and ministers, Kleinmann and Dorpmüller, and said, "We are beginning preparations for Operation Barbarossa. We will not succeed if we do not multiply our railway network potential in the Polish territories occupied by us, in the area of the conquered Poland, primarily in the general government territory. We must start the procedures for modernizing the railway and road networks. This is now a priority. From July 1940 to May 1941, Plan Otto I was implemented in the territory of Poland, followed by Plan Otto II. These plans aimed to provide logistical, or rather infrastructural support for Operation Barbarossa. It was a colossal challenge. Germany decided to modernize 7 main railway lines in the conquered Polish territory, spanning over 300 kilometers. Just for the modernization of the railway network in the general government between the fall of 1940 and the spring of 1941, they spent over 300 million Reichsmarks and poured 300,000 tons of steel. These were enormous investments. What exactly did these railway investments entail? The Polish railway network was deemed outdated and weak. You can't see it on the map because you only see the railway line, but the railway line itself varies. There are single-track lines, double-track lines, narrow-gauge lines, lines where trains can travel at high speeds, and others where, for example, the track beds are so weak and sparse that trains cannot travel quickly. Infrastructure is also crucial. It depends how many water stations or cranes you have. Where will you refill water in the locomotives? How extensive is your network of coal cranes and coal bunkers? How extensive is your signaling system? Are the railway tracks strong, weak, dense, or sparsely laid? Consequently, for example, a heavy train may or may not pass. If a train can only travel at 30 km per hour on a particular line, you'll pass fewer trains through that line in a day. If it can travel at 60 km per hour, then you'll pass twice as many. If you have a double-track line at your disposal, you're in a favorable position. Are the railway lines interconnected with telephones? In short, the Germans poured hundreds of thousands of tons of steel, a vast amount of bricks, cement cables, 300 million Reichsmarks, and they introduced tens and then hundreds of thousands of workers, including Poles from the general government forced for work on Plan Otto. On June 22, 1941, they were ready to attack, while on the other side, Stalin had nothing comparable. There was a buffer zone, 150 kilometers of logistical emptiness. The Red Army, which might have wanted to attack the Germans, did not have the rear support on its territories in eastern Poland to properly deploy for battle, while Hitler built such support at the expense of enormous money and materials. Additionally, he modernized the railway network in East Prussia, which meant that on June 22, 1941, Hitler was ready and Stalin was not. This is interesting in the context of various alternative histories. Today, in the public sphere, there is a pseudo-historical view that if Poland had joined Germany, which was unacceptable for Poland at that time, the Polish army would have been an addition to the crusade to the east, which could have caused the fall of the Soviet Union. This view might be expressed by a total ignoramus, but not in political matters, only in logistical, technical, military matters. Poland, with its inefficient railway network, as a country, did not have the technical support necessary to develop large, powerful million-man armies with high technological resources. After conquering Poland, Germany had to build and expand this network, and yet, Plan Otto only reached the Bug River. Then there was again 150 kilometers of emptiness. The Soviet railway network on the borders of the Soviet Union in 1939 was twice as efficient as the railway network between the Bug River and the former eastern border of the Polish Republic. Despite such a gigantic effort, the German railways were inadequately prepared for Operation Barbarossa. This resulted, on one hand, from poor management, and on the other hand, from misguided priorities. During the Second World War, Germany faced serious problems with 3 strategic fundamental issues. Firstly, long-term planning. Secondly, optimizing efforts. But thirdly, and most importantly, they had a gigantic problem with absorption. We cannot understand the failure of Hitler's German Reich in the Second World War without understanding that the vast German Reich, which practically conquered or vassalized the entire Europe, was unable to absorb the conquered territories. Countries like Poland, France, and many others, when they were independent states, their economies worked and produced specific goods. However, after the conquest of these countries, Germany was unable to maintain the economic productivity that these territories had when they were independent states. The inability to absorb the potential of conquered Europe was one of many reasons. A very important reason for the German defeat was that the German Reich was a stronger and more powerful state than the Soviet Union. However, it faced a challenge of unprecedented scale. In 1941, the German Reich occupied vast areas of the Soviet Union, including Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Western Russia, yet it was again unable to effectively absorb this territory. Atop of that, in reality, the Russians were destroying the infrastructure. War is a system. An army is a system. The railway is also a system. When you have tracks but no water stations, water cranes, pressure water, or coal cranes, a locomotive will only travel 50 or 100 kilometers and then stop. It won't go any further. Tracks are just one element of a broader infrastructure, and the Germans quickly realized that the Soviet railway lines were poor. It wasn't just a matter of shifting tracks. They also had to replace railway ties. They needed to change the rails because it turned out they were made of poor quality steel. The Germans had to rebuild water stations, coal cranes, signaling, and telephone communication in the conditions of guerrilla warfare. As you can imagine, this was a difficult task.
It turned out that the Germans were not well prepared for Barbarossa. They sent 3.05 million soldiers, 600,000 horses, 600,000 vehicles, and 4,000 tanks. They had only 40,000 soldiers in the railway troops. That was just 6 railway regiments, a drop in the ocean of needs. To make it even stranger, the German system was so convoluted that the railway troops were a state within a state. The railways were excluded from the jurisdiction of the Army's operational commands in the areas they operated. The Field Army commander couldn't order the blowing up of a railway bridge because it wasn't under his jurisdiction. Only at the Army group level were there officers who could make such decisions. In 1941, the German railway troops were too weak to handle this system. But the railway troops were just an addition. The key was the structure of the railways themselves, which, although militarized, were primarily the responsibility of the Deutsche Reichsbahn.
Additionally, in the general government territory, the Germans established at the end of 1939 the General Government Railway, Ostbahn. There were 2 German railways. The first was a purely German one, let's say original, and then there was Ostbahn, where over 40,000 Polish railway workers were employed in the entire Ostbahn, including auxiliary units, technical and construction support. A total of 120,000 Poles worked between 1942 and 1943. Not only Polish policemen or officials had to work for Hitler's regime, 120,000 people were forced to work or collaborate with Ostbahn. These 2 railways were responsible for supplying and servicing Barbarossa. 90% of the railway transports heading east in 1941 passed through Poland or East Prussia. When the Wehrmacht entered Russia, it turned out to encounter emptiness. German planners counted on solving the problem of broad-gauge railways in the east by capturing large quantities of Soviet locomotives and wagons. The Soviet Union also had around 30,000 locomotives and 800,000 wagons. However, all of this was either taken away or destroyed by the Russians. The number of locomotives captured in 1941 that could be used was less than 500. Only a few thousand serviceable wagons were captured. In 1941, this meant that even if some wagons were captured, they were broken. There was no way to repair them. The entire infrastructure was in ruins. Germans entered a devastated railway country and advanced 600 kilometers deep into the Soviet Union. Their logistics relied heavily on trucks and quickly wore out. The railway was inefficient. Plan Otto only worked up to the Bug River. Then, metaphorically speaking, a black hole began. Between June and December 1941, the Germans completely paralyzed the railway system. No one was in control. Railway lines were being rebuilt. Efforts were made to restore basic railway junctions, but it was not enough to support a 3.5 million strong army. It is often emphasized that Hitler was surprised by the winter. This is a myth. The Germans knew that they would remain in the Soviet Union for the winter, even if the Soviet Union collapsed. The Germans would stay there as victors. The Wehrmacht prepared winter clothing for its soldiers. However, this winter clothing did not arrive. It stood in wagons in Warsaw, Königsberg, and Breslau, while the Germans were freezing near Moscow and Leningrad. Ammunition did not arrive. Spare vehicles and guns as well. Winter clothing for the soldiers was stuck in gigantic railway jams. In the autumn of 1941, a traffic jam formed at the Warsaw Railway Junction, with several hundred German railway trains waiting simultaneously. Each was filled with supplies for the Wehrmacht in the east. However, they could not proceed eastward. In 1941, the entire Soviet railway network comprised 106,000 kilometers of tracks. As a result of Operation Barbarossa, the German army occupied an area with 40,000 kilometers of railway tracks, almost 40% of the Soviet railway network. Unfortunately for the Germans, they did not capture wagons or locomotives. They did not acquire water towers or rail yards either. The German army only captured the rails, and most of these rails were unusable because they did not have the gauge needed for the German railway. Additionally, many of the tracks themselves were of poor quality, where locomotives could only travel slowly. The slower the locomotive, the fewer trains the railway line could handle per day. The Germans did what they could. But if you only have 40,000 railway troops, and if the railway does not function properly because they were not allocated the necessary resources, you cannot fix the situation. By 1941, the Germans had made a tremendous effort on the captured territories, using tens of thousands of Poles and Jews for forced labor on the railways. By October 1941, until the culmination of Operation Typhoon, the Germans had rebuilt 16,140 kilometers of the 40,000 kilometers of tracks they had captured. That's not a small amount. But from the perspective of the goals of Operation Barbarossa, it was still insufficient, especially on the main Moscow offensive direction. Within the sector of Army Group Center, only 4,500 kilometers of tracks were reconstructed by October. By December, the German railway troops reconstructed a railway network stretching 23,400 kilometers in the USSR. They rebuilt approximately 50% of the Soviet railway network. However, the capacity of the railway network cannot be assessed solely based on the quantity of tracks. The railway system was still not repaired. When winter came, the system collapsed completely. The Germans estimated that for Barbarossa to be conducted effectively, meaning that troops would be constantly replenished with new personnel and supply at least 120 trains per day needed to depart to the front lines. For the efficient functioning of German army offensive operations, a minimum of 3,600 trains per month was needed. In 1941, the Germans didn't even come close to these figures. By autumn, the railway began to collapse completely. Heinz Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Army, who was relieved of his position in December 1941, captured this situation perfectly. Guderian said, "I have no fuel for tanks, no winter clothing for soldiers. I won't even mention the lack of tanks. Winter clothing for my soldiers has been stuck in a rail jam in Warsaw for 2 months. When I call, I'm told that the trains with winter clothing are on their way. It's just a pity they can't get through." In the Third Reich, there weren't enough tanks to replenish the losses suffered during Operation Barbarossa. They didn't have enough airplanes either. Fuel was also running low. In 1942, Germany rebuilt and modernized the entire railway network of the Soviet Union in the areas reached by the Wehrmacht. By December 1942, under the Ostbahn program, a total of 40,000 kilometers of railway tracks were reconstructed at the cost of hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks. Germany reconstructed the Soviet Union's railway network by December 1942. Without the success of the Ostbahn program, Marshal von Manstein couldn't have won the Battle of Kharkov in the winter of 1943 because the railway wouldn't have transported the SS Armored Corps to the battlefield. But to defeat the Red Army after 1943, they needed not 3 million soldiers, but 5 million. This means that 6,000 or 7,000 trains per month should have arrived instead of 3,600. Ultimately, Germany provided logistical support to its army on the Eastern Front in a satisfactory manner for its size, but unsatisfactory in terms of building the potential for effective and victorious combat against the Red Army. When Albert Ganzenmüller became the Secretary of State in the Ministry of Transport and the deputy head of Deutsche Reichsbahn, he not only focused on building bridges and water towers, but also initiated mass production of locomotives together with Albert Speer. This is a remarkable phenomenon. Several locomotives were coming out of production facilities in the Third Reich and occupied countries every day. For comparison, USSR mass-produced locomotives before the war. When the war broke out and the Soviet Union faced a critical situation, locomotive production was halted. Railway rolling stock plants transitioned to tank production. That's why the USSR had so many tanks, because they weren't producing locomotives. Germany's potential in the East did not increase their army. Whether it was in 1941 or 1944, it always counted no more than 3.5 million on East. Germany, if it had allocated resources differently, could perhaps in World War II produce the same number of tanks as USSR did. It was possible in theory, but decisions had to follow, which would mean the end of submarine construction V-2 rockets or heavy tanks. Entire war Germany couldn't decide how this allocation of resources should look like. In that case, all power of Germany was never clearly turned against the Soviet Union, except beginning of their campaign during those hottest months of summer and autumn of 1941. Germany, alongside tanks, continued locomotive production in locomotive manufacturing plants. Today, we overlook this when discussing why Germany lost the war. They had to produce everything to wage a war of attrition. Locomotives, tanks, planes, submarines. It's also because they could not absorb properly such vast territories. They had to modernize conquered lands for wartime needs, not for the people who lived there, as the Nazis persecuted and destroyed those nations, but for the road and railway infrastructure. Today in Poland, many railway elements and networks are still reminiscent of the Ostbahn program and Otto Plan. By 1943, Germany had reconstructed the railway system in the east, but for them it was too late. While they were producing locomotives and laying new tracks, the Soviet Union didn't need to do so, as it had old locomotives and pre-war infrastructure. Many factories have been evacuated on the east when Germany started Barbarossa. Germany had rebuilt the railway system in the east, but they still lacked enough tanks, artillery, and airplanes. The USSR rebuilt the might of the Red Army, and that might continued to grow. Germany, embroiled in a war on multiple fronts, couldn't multiply the power of the Wehrmacht in the east. The Wehrmacht was strongest in the east in 1941, but thereafter it only weakened. In 1941, their logistics were inadequate. Then, when they improved logistics, it didn't give them much because they started a war with the whole world which consumed not only their army, but also the German economy. This is precisely the forgotten but very important element in the history of World War II. It is unfortunate that today we don't talk about people like Julius Dorpmüller, Wilhelm Kleinmann, or Albert Ganzenmüller without their effective actions. The great German army couldn't have come close to Moscow or moved southeast towards the city of Stalingrad because the railway failed. Still, that's a topic for another story. In this series of films, we want to show that war is not just clashes of divisions and great battles, but equally important is what happens behind the front lines. Maybe the rear of the front is even more crucial. After all, war is a system.